The moon hung like a silver coin above the vast Montana plains, casting its cold glow over a lone rider fleeing into the night. Hooves pounded against the earth, kicking up dust that shimmered in the moonlight. Nita's breath came in sharp, ragged gasps, her wedding garments torn and flapping behind her like the wings of a broken bird. The wind whipped through her black hair, stinging her face, but she didn't dare slow down. Behind her, the war cries of her pursuers cut through the silence, a sound more chilling than the howls of the coyotes in the distant hills. They were gaining on her. She knew the voices well. They belonged to her own people, warriors of the Blackfoot tribe, men she had grown up alongside, men who had called her sister, daughter, friend. But tonight, they were hunters, and she was the prey. If they caught her, there would be no mercy. The marriage she had fled from was not simply a union. It was a bond of blood and politics, one she had dishonored by running. Chief Many Horses, her intended husband, was a powerful man, a ruthless man. She had seen what he did to those who defied him. A whistling sound split the air. An arrow. She ducked low against her horse's neck as the shaft streaked past her and buried itself in the ground ahead. Her mare, already exhausted, gave a panicked snort but kept running. Nita could feel the animal's strength waning, the heavy breaths, the trembling muscles beneath her. She whispered a desperate prayer. A voice rang out over the din of hooves. "Nita, stop this. Come back." Tuckoda, her brother. She clenched her teeth. Of all the warriors chasing her, he was the one she feared the most. Not because he would kill her. No, Tuckoda was too proud to strike down his own blood, but because he would drag her back. He believed in duty above all else, and to him, she had committed the gravest sin. Ahead, the land sloped down sharply. A river lay beyond, its surface a ribbon of silver in the moonlight. If she could reach it, maybe, just maybe she could lose them. But her horse stumbled. The beast was spent. Another arrow hissed through the air. This time, it struck her mare's flank. The animal gave a pained cry and collapsed mid-gallop, sending Nita tumbling into the dirt. Pain exploded in her side as she hit the ground hard, rolling through dry grass and dust. The taste of earth filled her mouth. She struggled to her feet, her vision swimming. The warriors were closing in. Panic clawed at her throat. She turned and ran. The river was close now, the rush of water growing louder. She didn't hesitate. She threw herself forward and leapt. The cold struck her like a hammer, knocking the air from her lungs. The current seized her, yanking her under, tossing her like a rag doll. She clawed for the surface, but the weight of her soaked garments dragged her down. For a moment, the world was nothing but darkness and water. Then, suddenly, she was free, breaking the surface with a gasping breath. The river carried her swiftly, dragging her away from the shouts of her pursuers. Tuckoda's voice rang out, frustrated and distant. "Nita!" But she was gone. The water carried her through the night. She clung to consciousness, her body numb with cold, until finally the river's wrath lessened. She drifted, her limbs too heavy to move, until she felt herself scrape against the shore. With the last of her strength, she crawled onto the muddy bank and collapsed. She didn't know how long she lay there. When she opened her eyes, dawn was breaking, and a shadow loomed over her. She tensed. The man standing above her was not Blackfoot. His face was lean, his jaw dusted with stubble, his eyes a piercing blue. He wore a long coat that had seen better days, a revolver holstered at his hip. A cowboy. He crouched down, studying her like a man, deciding whether something was worth keeping. "You alive?" he asked, his voice rough. She didn't answer. His eyes flicked to the river, then back to her. "Looks like somebody was trying to drown you," he mused. "Or maybe you were trying to drown yourself. Either way, not my business." He stood and adjusted his hat, as if he had already decided to walk away. Panic sparked in her chest. If he left her here, she would die. "Wait." Her voice was hoarse. He paused. She forced herself onto her elbows, her muscles protesting. "Help me." The man exhaled, rubbing his jaw. "That depends," he said. "You running from someone?" She hesitated. Then, with quiet certainty, she said, Yes. The cowboy studied her for a long moment. Then, without another word, he extended a hand. She took it. His grip was firm, steady. He pulled her to her feet, and she nearly collapsed again. He sighed. Looks like I just bought myself some trouble. From the hills beyond, the faint sound of distant war cries echoed through the morning air. The cowboy's expression darkened. Well, he muttered, guess that settles it. He nodded toward a nearby horse. Come on. If you want to live, you ride with me. She didn't question him. With the last of her strength, she mounted behind him, her fingers clutching the back of his coat. He spurred the horse forward, and they vanished into the wild. The wind cut sharp as a knife through the open plains, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. Nita clung to the cowboy's back, her fingers tight in the worn fabric of his duster. The horse beneath them was strong, its hooves drumming a steady rhythm against the hardened earth. Every jolt sent fresh pain lancing through her body, but she bit back any sound of discomfort. Weakness was a luxury she could not afford. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the wind, the steady creak of leather, and the occasional grunt of the horse. The cowboy rode with an ease that spoke of long years in the saddle, his frame rigid but relaxed, always alert. After what felt like hours, he finally broke the silence. You got a name? She hesitated. Her people knew her as Nita, but that name no longer belonged to her. The moment she had fled, she had severed herself from her old life. She wasn't sure who she was now. Still, she had to say something. Nita, she answered, though the word felt foreign in her mouth now. The cowboy gave a grunt, neither accepting nor rejecting it. Jack, he said after a pause. Jack Carver. She had heard the name before, whispered in trading posts and saloons. A gunslinger, a man who had once worn a badge but had long since abandoned the law. Some called him a hero, others a killer. She didn't know which one she needed him to be. Who's after you? He asked, his voice casual but laced with an undercurrent of wariness. My people. Jack didn't look back, but she felt the shift in his posture. He had expected bounty hunters or outlaws, not an entire tribe. That right. His tone was unreadable. She closed her eyes briefly, willing away the memories of Tuckota's voice calling her name, of Chief Many-Horse's cruel gaze when her father had promised her in marriage. I ran from a man I was supposed to marry, she admitted, her voice quiet. Jack let out a low whistle. That's the kind of trouble that don't just disappear. I know. He said nothing more, and they rode on. As the sun climbed higher, the land stretched endlessly before them. Rolling hills, golden fields, and the occasional lone tree standing like a sentinel against the sky. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out, its call sharp and lonely. Eventually, Jack pulled the horse to a stop near a cluster of boulders and dismounted. We rest here, he said, leading the horse to a trickling stream. He moved with slow, practiced efficiency, loosening the saddle straps, checking the animal's hooves. Nita slid off the horse unsteadily, her legs trembling from exhaustion. She nearly collapsed, but Jack's hand shot out, catching her arm before she could fall. His grip was firm, steady. You look like hell, he muttered. She smirked, a bitter edge to it. I feel worse. Jack motioned for her to sit, then reached into his saddlebag, tossing her a strip of dried meat and a canteen. She took them without hesitation, drinking deeply before biting into the tough venison. It was coarse, but it filled the emptiness in her stomach. Jack crouched nearby, chewing on his own portion. His hat was pulled low, casting his face in shadow, but his eyes remained sharp beneath the brim, always scanning the horizon. You figure they'll follow? He asked after a while. They won't stop, she admitted. Not until they have me. Jack sighed, rubbing his jaw. Hell of a mess you've got yourself into. She swallowed. I didn't have a choice. For the first time, he really looked at her. You always got a choice, he said, his voice quieter now. Might not be a good one, but it's there. She dropped her gaze. Maybe that was true, but what choice had she really had? Live as another man's property, or run and be hunted like an animal? She shifted uncomfortably, her fingers brushing against her torn garments. The wedding dress, once pristine, was now stained with dirt and blood. Jack must have noticed, because he reached into his pack and pulled out a spare shirt. "Here," he said, tossing it to her. "You'll stand out less in that." She hesitated before nodding in thanks. Turning away, she changed quickly, shedding the last remnants of the life she had left behind. When she turned back, Jack was already saddling the horse again. "We need to keep moving," he said. "Ain't safe to linger." She nodded, climbing back into the saddle behind him. They rode on, deeper into the wild. By nightfall, they reached the edge of a dense forest, its towering pines swaying in the cold wind. Jack led them inside, navigating through the underbrush until they found a small clearing. A campfire crackled to life under his careful hands, casting flickering shadows against the trees. Nita sat close to the warmth, rubbing her arms. The cold bit at her skin, but it was nothing compared to the ache in her bones. Jack leaned back against a fallen log, his revolver resting within easy reach. His face was unreadable in the firelight. "So," he said, his tone lighter now, "you ever killed a man?" She met his gaze steadily. "Not yet." Jack let out a dry chuckle. "Honest answer. I respect that." He poked at the fire with his stick. "You planning on learning?" She thought about it. The truth was, she had never imagined herself capable of killing. But if it came down to it, if Dakota or Chief Many Horses or any of the others tried to drag her back, could she do it? She exhaled. "If I have to." Jack nodded approvingly. "Good. You best be ready for that." The fire crackled between them. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. Then, suddenly, Jack went rigid. His hand moved fast, drawing his revolver in one smooth motion. Nita's breath caught. "What is it?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes were locked on the darkness beyond the firelight. Then, slowly he stood. "Stay close," he murmured. A branch snapped. Nita tensed, her pulse hammering. Then, out of the shadows, a figure emerged. Dakota. His face was grim, his dark eyes burning with fury. Behind him, 3 other warriors fanned out, their bows drawn, arrows nocked. Jack didn't move, his gun steady in his grip. "Well, hell," he muttered. "Guess we got company." Dakota's gaze flickered between them, landing last on Nita. "You dishonor us," he said, his voice laced with quiet rage. "Come home." Her fingers curled into fists. "I am home," she said, her voice steady. Dakota's jaw tightened. "I do not wish to hurt you." Jack cocked his revolver. "That makes one of us," he said flatly. Dakota's eyes narrowed. "This is not your fight, white man." Jack smirked. "It is now." The standoff stretched, tension thick as the smoke curling into the night air. Then, without warning, one of the warriors loosed an arrow. Jack fired. The night erupted in chaos. The night cracked open with gunfire and the hiss of arrows slicing through the air. Jack fired once, twice, quick, precise shots that sent one of Dakota's men sprawling backward. The warrior's bow fell from his hands as he clutched his chest, a sharp cry slipping from his lips before he crumpled into the dirt. Nita barely had time to breathe before Dakota surged forward, a knife gleaming in his hand. Jack pivoted, bringing his revolver up, but another arrow came whistling from the darkness, forcing him to lurch sideways. The shot went wide, missing Dakota by inches. The warrior crashed into Jack, and they hit the ground hard, rolling over the dirt in a tangle of limbs. Jack's gun was knocked from his grip, landing several feet away with a dull thud. Dakota wasted no time, raising his knife high, aiming for Jack's throat. Nita moved before she could think. She seized a fallen branch from the fire's edge, swinging it with all her strength. The burning wood struck Dakota's shoulder, embers scattering across his buckskin. He grunted, momentarily thrown off balance. Jack didn't hesitate. His fist shot up, slamming into Dakota's jaw with a bone-rattling crack. The warrior staggered back, his knife slipping from his grasp. Jack rolled to his feet, chest heaving. "Get down," he barked. Nita barely had time to drop before he yanked a second revolver from his belt, firing into the darkness. The muzzle flashed bright in the night, revealing the remaining warriors shifting through the trees. One of them loosed another arrow. Jack twisted aside, but the arrow sliced his shoulder, the force knocking him back a step. He grimaced, but his gun didn't waver. Dakota recovered fast, snatching up his fallen knife. His dark eyes burned with something raw, something close to betrayal, as he turned back to Nita. "You think this man will save you?" he said, his voice low, accusing. "You think the white man will not cast you aside when it suits him?" Nita's chest tightened. Jack, still clutching his bleeding shoulder, let out a rough chuckle. "Ain't about Savon," he drawled, keeping his revolver level. "Lady made her choice. Maybe you ought to respect it." Dakota's jaw tightened. For a long moment, there was nothing but the crackling fire and the distant howls of coyotes. Then, slowly, he lowered his knife. But the tension did not ease. "You are lost," Dakota said to Nita, his voice heavy. "And you do not even see it." She forced herself to hold his gaze. "I see plenty." His mouth pressed into a hard line. Then, without another word, he turned and melted into the darkness. The remaining warriors hesitated, glancing at one another. Then, silently, they followed him. The forest was quiet again. Only the dying fire remained, its embers glowing weakly in the cold night. Jack exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Well, that was something." Nita stared at the spot where Dakota had vanished, her pulse still hammering. She wasn't fool enough to think this was over. Dakota would return. Next time, he wouldn't come with just 3 men. She turned to Jack, eyeing the blood seeping through his sleeve. "Let me see." He grunted, but didn't argue as she stepped closer, peeling back the fabric. The wound wasn't deep, but the arrow had sliced clean through muscle. She tore a strip from what remained of her dress and pressed it against the gash. Jack hissed through his teeth. "Damn, woman. You'll live," she said dryly. He let out a breath, watching her for a moment. He was right about one thing. She frowned. "What?" Jack's expression was unreadable. "This ain't over." She knew that already. They had only bought themselves time. But sometimes time was all a person needed.